My name is Dan Milnor, and I've been a professional photographer since the late 1980s, completing assignments for a wide variety of clients. I now spend my time as a full-time creative evangelist for Blur Books, traveling to places like Europe, Canada, Australia, and the US to help creatives with their bookmaking projects. While I've done a wide range of work over the years, my favorite style of photography is the long-term documentary project. In other words, telling stories with my camera. There's a lot of things to learn when it comes to telling stories with a camera. I think the most obvious one is obviously that you have to practice. You've got to start somewhere. Do you have the desire to do this? And then the time to go out and practice. Basically, one of the bigger differences between just making pictures in general and telling pictures or telling stories with a camera is that a lot of times people will show me a portfolio, and a portfolio and a story are two completely different things. A portfolio is basically your best images, but it may not tell a story at all. And telling a story requires you to do some things photographically that sometimes people aren't prepared to do. Namely, that's showing images that might not be aesthetically perfect or aesthetically interesting, but they're critical for the viewer to understand what the story is. So there's a little bit difference and a certain type of practice that has to come with telling stories, because you need to include those really amazing images because those kind of showcase your talent as a photographer. But you also may have to include something that aesthetically you look at and say, well, this isn't beautiful, this isn't interesting. But if I don't show this, the viewer is never going to understand the jump between these specific images. So how you put images together, things like editing and sequencing, become equally as important as the actual imagery themselves. And that's something that I've seen change a lot over the last few decades. Is when I went to photography school, editing was a huge part of what they taught us. And we had classes that we did nothing but edit. And those are typically not taught anymore. And so the editing and the sequencing of images is really where the magic happens. And I was lucky because I'm old enough to have lived through sort of the end of the classic photo industry. And most of the time when I was early in my career, every time I did an assignment, I got to work with an editor. I got to work with someone whose only job in life was to edit photographs. Most of the time, and this is kind of something that surprises people, many of the best editors I worked with were not photographers at all. They had no interest in making pictures. They had, in fact, in many cases, had never made pictures before. But what they were good at and what they understood was how to put and sequence and link images together. And they really opened my mind about, yes, getting the best images possible is critical, but it's also critical as to how you put them, in what order you put them, how you sequence them together. And that's really something that takes a lot of time to learn. And it also is something that you can reach out to get help for. You know, I have friends who I really trust that if I'm having struggles with an edit or a sequence, I can turn to them and say, what do you think about this? And that makes a huge difference, because sometimes we fall in love with our own pictures, and you may fall in love with an image that you think, oh, this 100% has to be in the story. And an editor looks at it and says, no, I understand you love that image, but that does not belong in the story. So you have to make some painful decisions. I still have my film cameras, I have a multitude of film cameras, but the two primary systems that I used for most of my career were Leica rangefinders, and I use an M4 and an M6, and then I use a Hasselblad as well. So I love the square format. I love medium format. I shoot most of my portraits with the Hasselblad. So I still have those film camera systems, and if I had my choice, which I don't often do, but if I had my choice, I would shoot film all the time. I would say that the vast majority of work that I think is decent that I've done over the years has all been with film cameras. But there is one little problem with this now in my life, which is strictly a logistical problem. It has nothing to do with quality or carrying film or traveling with film or anything like that. I have a lot going on in my life. I have a lot of interests that are outside of photography that I'm heavily involved in. So logistically, the one thing that keeps me from using film cameras all the time is the scanning. Because what I would have to do living here in Santa Fe is I would have to ship my film to a lab. I use two or three different labs in Southern California. I would ship my film there. They would process the film. They would scan the film, and they would either ship it back to me or they would put it on an FTP server and I could download it. But the problem is that's 2, 3, 4 days at times waiting for that film. And the problem is that I'm on the road so much and I have so many projects going that logistically film is a real challenge for me. A lot of the projects that I do now, which are a little bit unlike the projects that I used to do back in the film era or back when I was working full time as a photographer, now there are a lot of other variables in play. And so I've sort of come to an arrangement with digital. I was someone who I went digital early, way way back in the late 90s, I was fully digital and working full-time as a photographer when none of my friends were shooting digital. Most people were telling me that I was crazy, I was going to go out of business, that digital was never going to work. And I thought, no, I think it's going to work. I think it's definitely the future of photography. But I had a very short honeymoon with digital, and I ended up switching back to film when most of my colleagues were finally switching to digital. And I was primarily a film photographer my entire career. And so I really love the medium. I love the cameras. I love what film forces me to do in the field. But today I'm using primarily shooting digital. And then for specific projects, I go back to the film. The Leica is a camera. It's funny. The Leica rangefinder in particular is a very, very unique machine. And I don't think there is a camera in history that's made more famous historical images around the world in the history of photography than the Leica rangefinder. I really think it's at the top of the pyramid. But oddly enough, it's not a good camera for the vast majority of sort of other kinds of photographs. You know, if you're a sports photographer or a landscape photographer, whatever, the rangefinder, Leica rangefinder is not the camera you're going to buy. But for the one thing that it's designed for, which is reportage or documentary photography, to me, it's the best camera that's ever been made. You know, I often, depending on the time I have, if I'm doing a serious story that I am going to show to more people than my mother, basically, then I still think making prints is the best way that you can do that. And there's a couple of reasons why I say that. When you make prints, it forces you to apply a specific level of critical thought to your work that I don't see people doing in the digital space. It's the same thing when someone walks up to me and says, will you look at my work? And I say yes. And they walk up to me with an iPad. There's a big difference in walking up to me with an iPad or walking up with a box of prints. It has very little to do with the quality of the work, but what it tends to have everything to do with is the quality of the edit. And when you make prints, it forces you to look at an image and say, is this good enough? Is this really good enough? Because I'm going to not only print this, I'm going to have to pay for the print. And it's also really easy to lay prints out on a table and edit and sequence them. It's far easier to do that than to do it in the digital space. Doing it on a laptop screen, which I see people doing all the time, that is incredibly challenging to be able to really get to be able to see that. Now, there is a shortcut here and something I just did. I came back from Albania a couple of weeks ago and I worked on a project there for a couple weeks. And while I was there, immediately after I started shooting, once I got in the country, I began laying out and designing a magazine from the work. In the software that I was using, there was a button that's called Manage Spreads or Manage Pages. And when I'm laying pages out in a magazine, I could click on that button and it would show me in the digital space on my laptop screen, it would show me the entire layout of the magazine. And then I could drag and drop different spreads into different places. And I sat with another photographer who was the one that was sort of leading the trip that I was on in Albania. And she and I would sit and look at my work and she would, give me feedback and say, oh, move that spread over here. That was as close to the physical print editing as I've come. It's a tool that I now use pretty much every single day. I'm always putting spreads into the software and moving them around to see how they best fit, because in trying to do that with thumbnails in laptop or in Lightroom, it's kind of tricky. I work full-time for Blurb. It's a software called Bookright, and it was a new feature in the software that came out, I think 2 or 3 upgrades ago, and Albania was really for me the first time that I used it extensively. And the other photographer had said to me, wow, that, she said, even if I don't make a book in this software, that tool is worth using because it just gives you such a great bird's eye view of what your entire project is. And I ended up with 92 pages of magazine from 2 weeks of working. And I must have spent, 2/3 of my online time in that one tool. Thanks for having me, Marc. I always enjoy doing this. Happy when people comment as well. So let me know what you want to talk about. And I'm happy to do this whenever we can. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us again, Dan. We love having you part of AYP. And thank you for watching. Hey, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any of our new episodes. And remember to leave your comments. We love hearing from you. Please share, please like, and remember to get out and capture your own images of life.